you know, we got time or so,
Sounds old.
and everything's looking great. So whenever you're ready.
Okay. All right. Um, well, it started in 2007, and we were just kind of having fun on jet skis as a bunch of friends. And we used to go out to Rum Point every Sunday with our friend's father's boat, and we all had jet skis. And we one time in early 2008 decided to, a couple of us decided to do Jet Around Cayman. It was at the time one of the longest jet ski races, endurance speaking, in the world. And if you know anything about the water around here, it's actually the deepest water that there is a jet ski race in the world. And two of the guys decided that they wanted to do that. And you had to have teams in Cayman at the time, as opposed to the US and Canada where you just could race individually. And part of that is someone needed to manage the team. And for some reason, they just decided to pick me because I was the most organized person. And for some reason, I said yes. And as I was getting them prepped to do this race, I realized that I actually didn't have a single clue as to what I was doing. So I decided to enter the race and do it myself. And when we finished the race, and it was in June 2008, when we finished, I was told that I had apparently set a world record for being the first woman to complete the race without a secondary rider, because you can have a secondary rider. And I also became the first woman to complete the longest jet ski race, which is 75 miles long. After that, I was invited by some Canadian racers to go to Canada and race stand-up jet skis as well as runabout or sit-down jet skis. And I started racing the U.S.-Canada like East Coast circuit for a few years. And we decided to call ourselves Notwooken just because that was the name of the boat that our friend's father had. There was no real other reason than that was just the one we decided to name it. And nobody could ever understand it or even pronounce it correctly, especially in the States and Canada. But we ended up being really successful. After that jet around, we had some team members change, and we started racing all over the United States and all over Canada. And the first World Finals that I went to was in 2009 in Lake Havasu City. And in 2010, I raced at the World Finals and got into an interesting accident, which we'll talk about at some point. In terms of Jet Around Cayman, I remember distinctly when we first set out to do it that obviously it's an endurance race. You have to be 20 yards outside of the reef, which is a football field's distance from the reef. And that is incredibly deep water, and the choppier it is, the actually more likely it is that you can even drown. We went through months of practice and months of planning, and we had to take all of these maps and do depth perception and point-to-point rides and figure out where the reef breaks were and wrecks were. And it was a really interesting thing to do because you really have to methodically think about what you're doing, as opposed to when you're doing something like circuit racing where you're riding buoy to buoy in a lake. That's a very different thing. When we initially practiced for Jet Around, we broke the island up into thirds, and we did 7 Mile Beach to north side to East End to South Sound, 7 Mile Beach again. And we would just practice those legs individually, and then ultimately we went around. You only really want to go around once because there's a very good chance that your equipment won't make it around a second time. It's a very delicate thing to do. I remember when we did it in 2008, helmets were not mandatory. So we never rode with helmets. And I actually came away with quite the sunburn on the top of my head. It was very interesting. And I also remember I was at about East End Point. I had just come out of the checkpoint because there are 3 checkpoints that you have to hit going in and out of the reef. And I got this, those flying fish with the wings. I had a flying fish come up, slap me on the face, and just like he was sitting there like flapping his wings on my face, and just sort of, I peeled him off. That was the most surreal experience I've ever had in my life. And when you're doing that race, when you come about halfway, you sort of feel that you're almost at one with nature. It's like a very sort of 127 hours type experience where you sort of wonder, can I actually make it any further? Am I going to drown? Am I going to get eaten by some large fish or something ridiculous like that? And then when you actually finish, you are so dead. It's not even funny, but it was an interesting experience. And I understand that lots of people wonder if women have the capacity to do those kinds of things. And scientifically, it's true. There's a male-female difference. Men have 30% more muscle mass than women naturally. So I understand the hesitation there. But there have been several women that have done Jet Around Cayman after me. I think it just took someone to just kind of do it and prove that it could be done and move forward. And it's a shame that they're not doing that race anymore because it was a highly anticipated run. It differed quite a bit from racing in the U.S. and Canada. Up there had been women that raced circuit for years, and that was much more competitive than in Cayman. And I raced in the U.S. and Canada with both men and women. And just in general with racing, I find that there's a lot of harassment that goes towards women for racing jet skis. I feel one of the socially related aspects and downsides really to racing jet skis is I sort of never was able to be seen as a woman. I was seen as one of the guys, which I'm fine with. But when you take your boyfriend to your jet ski races, it can be very emasculating. I've found maybe that was just the guys that I dated, but it's an interesting dynamic, especially when you race against men as well as women. In the World Finals, you cannot race pro races against men. You can race amateur classes, mixed gender, but you cannot race pro men's class. And that's understandable because you're trying to keep, as much, competitive advantage as possible to each class. But I really have always kind of been disappointed in the lack of female participation in the sport. I think that we are just as able as men to do things like that, albeit if it's stand-up racing or runabout racing. I personally feel that the women that have been involved in this sport have also been a lot more aggressive than some of the men, and extremely capable and competitive. I think that if more women did it, I think they'd find that it's a lot easier than they expect it to be. And there's a very big family aspect to the racing community. It's a lot smaller than it used to be. When you kind of think about jet ski racing as it was in the past, it was very popular in the 80s and 90s. The first jet ski was invented in the 1970s, around the same time that, Tony Alva and Jay Adams and Stacy Peralta were doing all the skateboarding stuff. And it was obviously invented in California, as most good things are. In the 80s and 90s, the sponsorship was incredibly high on jet ski racing. They had ESPN coverage, and it just sort of died down after 2000. And I really feel that Notwooken as a team really did a lot to bring back a larger attention to jet ski racing. I was a big participant in the sport in many different countries, the United States, Canada, the United Kingdom, and Cayman Islands. I ran Notwooken Racing for 7 years, and we also helped sponsor the Canadian Watercross Association's team to increase. I want to do that again.
Yeah, no worries. You're doing
yeah.
great. It's a lot. Lots of
I like
mouthfuls.
to remember. Notwooken was the biggest sponsor with the CWA, Canadian Watercross Association, when it initially restarted a Canadian tour. And we did that for several years before the team closed in 2013. In terms of my career, I had a good run up until 2012.
Sorry, no, stop for 1 second.
What is that?
Sounds like a mechanical cat.
So we go what?
Mechanical cat.
Okay.
You're really conversation.
Still working with cat real quick.